and Joseph was brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. The desert heat shimmered over the trade routes of Canaan. A teenage boy stood bound in the shadows of a merchant caravan. His world had collapsed into a transaction of silver and cold betrayal. We must look closely at the dust of Dothan and the ledgers of ancient Egypt. The narrative of Joseph is often dismissed as a colorful desert myth. Yet the forensic reality of the Bronze Age tells a far more chilling and precise story. Within the gate of a forgotten city and the fibers of ancient papyrus, we find the fingerprints of a historical event that matches the biblical record with terrifying accuracy. If the account of Joseph being sold into slavery is merely a legend, then why does the price of his life align perfectly with the economic reality of the 18th century BC? Consider the weight of the silver in those merchants' hands. It was not a random sum chosen by a later storyteller. It was the exact market value of a human soul in the Middle Bronze Age. As we peel back the layers of the Levant, we find that the geography and the bureaucracy of the time provide a silent witness to the Genesis account. You should take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments on whether you believe ancient archaeology can truly prove the motives of the heart. The sun beat down on the pits of Dothan. Joseph had traveled from the Vale of Hebron to seek his brothers. He found them, but he did not find the welcome of kin. They saw him from afar. The dreamer in his distinctive tunic was an easy target for a jealousy that had simmered for years. They cast him into a dry cistern, a hollow echo in the earth where hope was meant to die. As a caravan of Ishmaelites approached from Gilead, a darker plan took shape among the brothers of the patriarch. They would not leave his blood on their hands. They would let the market of Egypt swallow him whole. The price was set, the silver changed hands. The brothers watched as the boy disappeared into the dust of the spice trade. Silver shekels found. The economic precision of the biblical text is a forensic anchor. The book of Genesis records that Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Dr. Kenneth Kitchen discovered through comparative analysis of Near Eastern law codes in 1964. The price of slaves was not a static number throughout history. In the 18th century BC, the Code of Hammurabi and the records of Mari confirm that 20 shekels was the standard price for a young male servant. If this story had been written centuries later, the author would have likely cited 30 shekels, which was the price recorded in the time of Moses. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the price had soared to 50 or 60 shekels. The specific mention of 20 shekels places the story of Joseph firmly in the Middle Bronze Age. It reflects a window of time that a later forger could not have known. Each silver piece was likely a cast ingot or a rough ring. There were no minted coins in this era of the patriarchs. The weight of the silver had to be measured on a scale. The merchants would have carefully balanced the metal against stone weights. This transaction was a legal contract in the eyes of the Ishmaelites. They were transporting a high-value asset to the markets of the Nile. We see this same economic reality reflected in the records of the Middle Kingdom, where Asiatic slaves were highly sought after for their skills. The silver was a physical manifestation of Joseph's transition from a son to a commodity. It represents the cold mathematics of the ancient world. You might want to like this video if you find these archaeological links to the biblical text fascinating for your research. Dr. William Albright identified the significance of these price fluctuations in his studies of the patriarchal period in 1930. He noted that the biblical record preserves a memory of a specific economic era. The 20 shekels paid for Joseph are a chronological marker. They act as a timestamp for the journey into Egypt. The Ishmaelites were not just traders. They were the conduits of a global economy that stretched from the hills of Canaan to the palaces of Pharaoh. The silver found in various hoards across the Levant matches the purity and the form of the currency used during this exact period. It was a world of weight and measure, a world where Joseph's life was calculated to the gram. The brothers thought they were finishing a rivalry, they were actually fulfilling a prophecy that required a specific price. This silver did not just buy a slave. It funded the survival of a nation that had not yet been born. We must consider the probability of such a detail being accurate by chance. It is statistically improbable that a fictional legend would get the inflation rates of the ancient world correct. The presence of 20 shekels in the text is a quiet but powerful testimony. It speaks of an eyewitness account or a perfectly preserved oral tradition. The forensic evidence of the silver trade remains one of the most compelling arguments for the antiquity of the Genesis text. It grounds the narrative in the hard reality of the marketplace. The caravan moved south. The hills of Canaan receded behind the weeping eyes of a broken son. Joseph was bound to the rhythmic gait of the camels. He was a stranger in a land that would soon become his crucible. The Ishmaelites followed the way of the wilderness. They passed through the rugged terrain toward the border of the delta. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom was at its height. A land of massive monuments and complex bureaucracy awaited the arrival of the Hebrew slave. Joseph was sold to Potiphar, a man of status and power in the court of the sovereign. The transition was absolute. The shepherd had become a household steward. He learned the language of the Egyptians. He mastered the art of management in a house that was not his own. Genesis Papyrus proves Joseph sold. The administrative reality of Egyptian slavery is documented in a remarkable find. The Brooklyn Papyrus 35.1446 was analyzed by Dr. William Hayes in 1955. It contains a list of 95 servants in a single Egyptian household. Remarkably, over half of the names listed are Semitic rather than Egyptian. This document dates to the 13th Dynasty, which aligns with the historical window of Joseph's arrival in the Delta. It proves that Asiatic people from the Levant were common in high-status Egyptian homes. They were not just laborers, but often held positions of trust. The papyrus includes names that are linguistically similar to those found in the biblical genealogy. It shows that the migration of Semites into Egypt was a documented historical phenomenon. This is the forensic backdrop of the Genesis account. 'Tis the paper trail of the ancient world. The names on the list often include a notation that the servant was acquired through trade. This mirrors the sale of Joseph to the captain of the guard. Dr. Pierre Montet discovered evidence of Semitic settlements in the eastern delta at Tenes in 1930. These sites confirm a massive influx of people from QAnon during the Middle Bronze Age. The Genesis account describes Joseph being promoted to the head of Potiphar's house. This is exactly the type of career path reflected in the Egyptian records for talented foreign servants. The papyrus details the specific titles and duties assigned to these individuals. They managed granaries and overseen the estates of the elite. This evidence strips away the idea that Joseph's story was a cultural impossibility. It shows that the Egyptian system was designed to absorb and utilize people like him. The papyrus acts as a census of the shadows. It gives a voice to the thousands of Asiatics who lived alongside the Egyptians. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the historical record, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss a new investigative report. The ink on the Genesis papyrus is a physical link to the world Joseph inhabited. It confirms that the biblical description of Egyptian life is not a caricature. The text mentions the officer of Pharaoh buying Joseph. This reflects the specific hierarchy of the Middle Kingdom court. The forensic details of the papyrus show that these servants often took Egyptian names, just as Joseph was later renamed by Pharaoh. We are looking at a society that was highly organized and obsessed with documentation. Every transaction was recorded. Every slave was accounted for. The presence of so many Semitic names in a domestic context proves that Joseph was part of a larger historical movement. The Genesis papyrus does not just prove that slavery existed. It proves that the specific circumstances of Joseph's life were typical for the period. The evidence is carved in stone and written on reed. It tells a story of migration, of trade, and of the rise of foreigners in a land of kings. The years of service were followed by years of iron. Joseph found himself in the king's prison after a false accusation. He was forgotten by the cupbearer, but remembered by the divine. He interpreted the dreams of the ruler of the Nile. The famine was coming, a 7-year drought that would bring the world to the feet of Egypt. Joseph was raised from the dungeon to the chariot. He became the vizier over all the land. The grain was stored, the people were fed. And eventually, the brothers who sold him appeared at his feet. They did not recognize the Egyptian lord as the brother they had betrayed. They saw only a man with the power of life and death. The climax of the story is one of restoration. The dreamer had become the provider. Dothan Gate located. The geography of the betrayal is no longer a matter of debate. The site of Tel Dothan was excavated by Dr. Joseph Free starting in 1953. He uncovered the remains of a massive city gate dating to the Middle Bronze Age. This is the very gate through which the Ishmaelite caravan would have passed on its way to Egypt. It stands as a silent witness to the transaction between the brothers and the traders. The excavation revealed that Dothan was a major hub on the primary trade route from Gilead to the coast. It was the logical place for a caravan of spices and resins to stop. The gate complex includes a massive stone threshold and defensive towers. It shows that Dothan was a fortified and significant urban center. During the time of the patriarchs, Dr. Free found evidence of the specific type of pottery used by the people of Canaan during the 18th century BC. This confirms the occupation of the site during Joseph's life. The proximity of the grazing lands to the city gate explains why the brothers were in the area with their flocks. It was a region known for its rich pastures and vital water sources. The discovery of the gate provides a physical location for the narrative. It anchors the story in a tangible landscape. We can now walk where the brothers stood, can see the path the camels took as they turned toward the south. The forensic analysis of the soil and the structures at Tel Dothan matches the biblical description perfectly. It is a place where the roads of history and faith collide. The gate was the heart of the city's commerce. Any sale of a slave would have been known to the guards and the elders who sat there. The Ishmaelites would have paid the toll at this very spot before continuing their journey. The 20 pieces of silver might have been weighed within sight of these walls. The location of Dothan is a geographical proof. It shows that the author of Genesis had an intimate knowledge of the terrain of Canaan. This was not a story written by someone in a distant land. It was recorded by someone who knew the gates, the wells, and the roads of the Levant. The ruins of the Dothan Gate are a monument to the accuracy of the biblical record. They remind us that the events of the Bible took place in a real world of stone and timber. The case for Joseph is built on the hard evidence of silver, papyrus, and stone. It is a story that survives the scrutiny of the spade and the scroll. We see the 20 shekels of the Middle Bronze Age. We see the Semitic servants in the Egyptian records. We see the gates of Dothan, where the journey began. This is not a fable. It is a historical reality that demonstrates the reliability of the Genesis account. The life of Joseph reminds us that even when we are sold into the pits of life, there is a sovereign hand guiding the silver and the grain. The evidence suggests that the biblical writers were committed to historical truth. They recorded the prices, the names, and the places with an accuracy that continues to stun modern researchers. We must decide what we will do with this evidence. If the history is true, then the message behind the history must also be weighed. Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace was not an accident. It was a meticulously planned rescue of a family and a future. We see the same patterns in our own lives, where the betrayals of today become the provisions of tomorrow. The silver was paid, the gate was passed. No record was kept for us to find thousands of years later. The historical reliability of Joseph is a pillar of the faith. It is a foundation that remains unshaken by the passage of time.